Are you tired of the same boring and unhealthy diet of corporate media propaganda and the distraction du jour? Your antidote is here at Cindy Sheehan's Soapbox. Real, revolutionary, and relevant news and talk with fascinating and brilliant guests. Prepare to be informed and motivated with your friend and host, Cindy Sheehan.
Welcome back to the Soapbox. I'm your host, Cindy Sheehan. For this edition, we'll be speaking with Chuck Zlatkin. Chuck is the legislative and political director of the New York Metro Area Postal Union, part of APWU, which is the American Postal Workers Union. Chuck and I are going to be talking about saving the public post office. Chuck's also a longtime peace and social justice activist. Stay tuned. We'll be right back with Chuck Zlatkin. Chuck Zlatkin, welcome to Cindy Sheehan Soapbox.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well,
it's a pleasure to be with you.
It's really nice to hear your voice. Full disclosure, Chuck and I have known each other for many years. Chuck was one of the first people I met after Casey died when I went on my crusade against the wars, and we met at a function in I know it was in New York City. I don't remember exactly.
It was in New York.
It wasn't right in
Yeah.
the city. Okay. And so we've known each other for a long time. Actually, we're actually friends. And so it's really good to get you here on the show to talk about something that I think many people here in the United States probably take the Postal Service, the United States Postal Service, for granted. I mean, it's just always there. It's always delivering our mail, taking our packages, whatever, for our entire lives. The letter carrier is ubiquitous. We just don't think about it that often. And there have been special attacks lately, especially because of the coronavirus. But it's actually surprising that the Postal Service hasn't been fully privatized by now, because that's been a goal for a long time. So why don't you talk a little bit about your special interest in the Postal Service, and then about the recent attacks against it?
Okay, well, I've been a postal worker for many years, and I'm involved in my union, both the national, the American Postal Workers Union, and my local New York Metro Area Postal Union. Right now, I'm the legislative and political director for the local, but we've been fighting to keep a public postal service, well, I guess for the entire time that I've been involved in this thing, because, as you correctly said, it's been under attack literally for decades. I mean, the Postal Service has been privatizing the Postal Service has been a goal of two elements primarily. First, you have the far right anti-government people, the anti-government, federal government people who have a special animus for the post office, because the post office is so popular with the American people. It's maybe the example of what can be done right. So they really have anger towards the Postal Service. And as the recent Pew poll, the Postal Service ranked as the most popular government agency once again, like with a 91% popularity rate. So you have that element, and then you have the other element that looks at the fact of how much volume, money that the Postal Service does every year. It's upwards of $80 billion now. And what really angers them is that, the biggest expense of the Postal Service is its employees, because it's so labor intensive. So people think, wow, if we could just get our hands on that money for our profit, we could eliminate these workers getting a living wage and cut back in service and use that for profit. So those elements have been pushing towards the privatization of the Postal Service, literally since the 70s. I mean, it was when the Heritage Foundation was formed, I think in 1973, privatization of the Postal Service was one of the things that they organized around. And for decades, there have been all kinds of pushes to privatize, and think tanks and politicians coming out with things and looking for stuff, but it really hasn't picked up speed until lately. But really, the groundwork for that was laid in 2006 when the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act was passed in the lame duck Congress. Actually, it was the last thing they did. I think they did voice votes. I think in the Senate at midnight, in the House at 4 a.m. as people were going home for the Christmas holidays or going home forever. And what that did, it created like a threefold effort to really clamp down on the Postal Service and create problems for it. That was where the pre-funding of the future retirees' health benefits for the next 75 years was legislated, and it had to be paid within a 10-year period. So that meant that the Postal Service every year had to pay $5.5 billion to the Treasury, which they did the first couple of years. But when the economy collapsed in 2008, when Wall Street and the bankers stole everything, and business slowed down, the post office was impacted then as it is now. And at that time, they used that legislation to force the closing of post offices and mail distribution facilities, and also change the delivery standards. So anyway, but with President Trump, who didn't start this stuff, but he definitely has accelerated it. Last year, he put together a task force to study, as he called, the postal system, and he put his buddy, Secretary of Treasury Steven Mnuchin, in charge of that group. They came out with a 78-page report, basically calling to privatize the post office. Prior to that, the Office of Management and Budget had come out with all these cutbacks that they wanted to bring it about, including the cutting back on the wages and benefits for workers, higher prices, and cut back in services. So those elements were there, and then along, as you correctly stated, with this pandemic coming along, which basically has done the same thing that happened in 2008. Slowing down the economy. Now, it's important for people to realize that the Postal Service, since 1970, receives no taxpayer money whatsoever from the federal government. There is no subsidy. It's been designed to be self-supporting, that by selling stamps and services, the post office would basically pay for itself. And that's what it's done since 1970. And now, because of the slowdown in the economy, I mean, people aren't using the mail. Companies aren't coming out with catalogs and big advertising mail stuff because of what's happening with the pandemic and the lockdowns and all that stuff. So the Postal Service is somewhere going to lose between 30 and 50% of its income. They're forecasting a $13 billion loss for the rest of this year.
Wow.
So the Postmaster General, Megan Brennan, went before the House Committee on Government Oversight April 9th and laid out the problem that was there and said that the Postal Service needs to get financial help from the government, to get it through this period so it will exist, beyond this pandemic situation. And there was bipartisan support from a lot of people in the House and the Senate, and it looked like they were trying. Initially, they put together like $31 billion for the Postal Service that would initially, get through the period of loss of income, and also the increase in expenses because of the pandemic. We can maybe get into that a little bit later. But then, as they were putting together the first bill to deal with the pandemic, I mean, they had no problem putting trillions of dollars into private corporations and businesses to get them the money, and nothing for the people. But when Mnuchin and Trump saw the money for the post office, they said, if there's any money for relief for the post office in there, we're going to veto the bill. And then what they eventually allowed was to loan the Postal Service $10 billion, which only added to the debt. Now, just recently, in the past few days, the Washington Post came out with an expose yesterday where they supposedly got in with people in both the Postal Service and the Treasury Department who are stating that they're going to use this loan, Mnuchin's going to use this loan to try and get in there and micromanage the Postal Service, including the raising of prices, putting pressure on the unions for givebacks, and also to control, to hire and fire who the people are, in the Postal Service. And it's really just outrageous what they're trying to do, all part and parcel of trying to accelerate the privatization. That's too long of an answer, wasn't it?
No, it was actually a perfect answer. And so, you remember Rahm Emanuel said, don't ever let a good crisis go to waste. So it does seem like this coronavirus issue is going to be another reverse Robin Hood, right? Stealing from the poor to give to the wealthy. So I just have a have a question, like, what some people may ask, and they may ask, what would be the difference if, like, UPS delivered our mail or the USPS? Why do we? And I'm just playing devil's advocate because I'm a big supporter, as you know, of the Postal Service. What would be gained by keeping the USPS?
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, the Postal Service, which is in the Constitution,
right,
and has been around a long time, has a mission and a purpose, and it is to provide universal service, meaning that wherever you live in this country, whatever your personal worth is or what zip code you're in, you're entitled to service. It's been clear by their own behavior that UPS and FedEx and DHL and all of these companies, they only want to deliver where it's profitable. And they use the Postal Service too. They put millions of packages into the post office, delivering to their customers in areas that they don't want to go to.
Right.
So, in a sense, it's very clear what would happen if they get involved in it. And so, just look around the world. Wherever there's privatization, what ends up is there's less service and it costs more. And to areas like in rural areas where they're really dependent upon the Postal Service, where there really aren't options. I mean, some of these areas, they still have dial-up, they have broadband. It would be devastating to people. And then the other aspect of it is people depend upon the post office for life-saving stuff. I mean, prescriptions. The Postal Service delivers 1.2 billion prescriptions every year for people. And this is like this life-saving stuff. It's stuff that keeps people sane, keeps people, from excruciating pain. They get it in the mail, 30-day supplies. There's no talk about what was going to happen to those people if the post office is allowed to go under. UPS or FedEx are going to deliver prescriptions to people? No way. So that's another reality that's not even addressed, is how important the Postal Service is to the people. And then there's the additional things that the postal workers do for the community. I mean, there are hundreds of postal workers a year that are honored for doing life-saving stuff. A letter carrier comes on, knows there's an elderly person living there. The mail is backed up. They haven't picked up the mail. They check on them. I mean, they're aware of what happens with people, communities, what's going on. I know from my own personal experience where I live, one day I got there with all emergency vehicles around where I lived, and someone said, "Oh yeah, the letter carrier came by, smelled gas, and called up the emergency people to come." I mean, that's what postal workers do in the way that they relate to people. And also, part of the reason the post office has such a high rating is because to a lot of people, well, who do they know from the so-called federal government? They know the letter carrier, the window clerk at the station. So none of this stuff is talked about because, we're dealing with people, and Mnuchin and Trump, who either are unaware of this or if they know about it, don't care. They don't care about people that find the Postal Service essential and reasonable. You can talk to people all the time about what their alternatives are. I mean, people who have, relatives incarcerated, it's the Postal Service that they can use the reasonable rates to send stuff to people. You talk to artists or people like that, and you say, who do you use to mail your stuff? Well, the Postal Service. I can go there, get all the packing for free, and the rates are reasonable. I mean, it's a part of the whole society. And then there's a whole mailing industry that employs, from all of these mailing houses and printers and whatever, publishers that employ, it's like 7 million people. They're all tied into using the Postal Service. So it's an important part of our society. It's an important part of the economy, and it binds us together. So it's just the same, blinded by greed people who want to get their hands on this and don't really care about the American people at all. And then there's also the fact that the Postal Service employs 640,000 people, pays them a living wage. I mean, it's the largest employer.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah, good benefits.
Yeah, good benefits, and it's the largest.
A thing that we need to talk about, too, is they're unionized, and a lot of conservatives have a problem with that.
Oh, yeah, there's a problem with the unionization and the rights that postal workers have because, again, you work for the post office, you're getting a living wage, you're getting retirement, you're getting benefits, and you have representation. Now, when the pandemic hit, the coronavirus hit, it's not like the postal management was any different than Amazon or McDonald's or Whole Foods or something in terms of taking care of their workers and providing them PPE and cleaning and dealing all of that stuff. But the difference between those workers and postal workers is postal workers are unionized. So immediately the unions got going, dealt with postal management. There's a collective bargaining agreement which shows what the management is required to do and basically got on the case for postal management to supply what the workers needed. Unfortunately, it wasn't fast enough because I think the latest count is that over 1,200 postal workers are positive for COVID-19, and over 45 have died because the people are out there doing this essential work, and initially they were doing it without
protection
gear to protect them. Yeah, so the unions are an important part of what it is to be a postal worker, part of the reasons why some of these ideologues are against us. But in Trump's case, he personalizes so much. So his antipathy towards Jeff Bezos, because of what the Washington Post does to him. Oh my
God, it's so ridiculous.
Created that whole straw man about going after Amazon and the Amazon contract with the Postal Service, and now the Postal Service isn't making enough money because they give too much of a deal to Amazon. So again, there it is. The same limited view and lack of intelligence of the President of the United States comes to the fore again. But he really has a case against the Postal Service, and again, steeped in ignorance. He has no knowledge whatsoever of how the Postal Service runs, what its history is, what it means to the American people, and what strangling it, starving it would do. I mean, it would really impact the economy. It would be horrific to people who depend upon it, and particularly now with people in lockdown, staying at home. Sometimes the only way they're getting stuff is through the mail, package deliveries and whatever. So it's just the whole thing is, outrageous and really, anti-people, because the Postal Service, again, is owned by the American people. It's a public postal service. It's a year older than the country, and it's right there in the Constitution.
Well, here at the Soapbox, we're against Trump because he's a president, but he seems to be especially vicious, kind of. This takes these personal vendettas against people, as we've seen. But besides, we talk about essential and non-essential, which I think is really stupid because there's many people deemed non-essential who really are essential to many people. But, the post office is, the postal workers, the letter carriers, the people at the window, the sorters, the truck drivers, they never stop. It's like what's that, wind, rain, snow, sleet, whatever.
Oh, yeah.
Pandemics, it doesn't matter if, here where I live, we have a new season called fire season, and there's always smoke coming. No matter what, we get our mail. So besides showing appreciation to our postal workers, what can we do? We're not advocates of calling your representative or whatever, but in this case, it might be something that could be effective.
Well, there are petitions that people can sign in support of the post office. Actually, probably the easiest one to go to is atw.org, and you can sign on there in support of keeping a public post office. I mean, again, we've seen, because, as I mentioned earlier, about the fact that people in rural states depend upon the Postal Service, that there is support, on both sides of the aisle. Even some of the most conservative people, when it comes to the Postal Service, are aware of it. So, reaching out to legislators and calling upon them to, keep a public post office and doing what's necessary to get through this crisis, it wouldn't be a waste of time, I think, for people to do. And then also there's a call for, hazardous pay for postal workers, in addition to a pat on the back,
right?
Maybe getting some money from it. So the workers are out there, they're doing this, and they're also concerned about bringing it home to their families.
Right.
How do I know if, I'm safe to come home on this? But, I have a special connection to my fellow postal workers because I've seen what they've been able to do under extraordinary circumstances. I mean, with anthrax, working through that, bomb threats or whatever. And we had, the storm Sandy a number of years ago in New York,
right?
If I have a moment to tell the story. So the storm knocked out electricity, including the Morgan facility, which is a large mail processing facility for New York City. It was below the area, so there was no power. And I went in with other people from the union to check on how the workers were doing. And we got into the facility, and there were workers in standing water. There was no electricity on, but everything was shut down. All the gates and the platforms, everything wasn't working. And there they were, by hand, putting planks down, getting the stuff onto the trucks to deliver the mail.
Wow.
And management was standing back. They weren't saying anything. They weren't. So in other words, if the electricity should come on, these people could be electrocuted. So we spoke to them and say, you do not have to do this. This is insane. You should just sign out, go home, and whatever. And two of the people came over and pointed at these huge wire cases just filled with people's prescriptions. And they said, we have to get this out.
Wow.
That's what our job is, that we're committed to do, and that's what we're going to do. Once we get that out, then maybe we'll leave. But right now, we can't leave people away from the medications that they desperately need, and that is what Trump and Mnuchin want to become policy. No way are they going to get their medication. So my heart, respect for my fellow postal workers, and my antipathy for these ridiculous people who have no sense whatsoever of what's going on. Because again, when they were giving millions or billions of dollars to these corporations, they never put limitations on it. So this $10 billion loan, the thing that the Washington Post revealed, is that they want to use that loan to control the Postal Service, to raise prices, put pressure on the unions, and make decisions about who's going to be hired and fired, what policy should be. This is all under Mnuchin. And I didn't see him doing that to Boeing.
Right.
He didn't say, you got to get all this money. Well, we want to get in there and take control of how you run your corporations and design unsafe planes and set in the air that kill hundreds of people. That's not a concern. But when it comes to the Postal Service, that's where we want to get in there and strangle this, so we can get our hands on those billions of dollars and give them up to our friends. And who gives a damn about the service or the postal workers who work there? I mean, postal workers, it's the largest employer of veterans and disabled veterans, huge employer of women. And in this country, the impact on the African American community. 28% of postal workers are African American, and African Americans make up 14% of the population. So it shows how important it is to that community. So on every aspect that you look at the Postal Service, it's essential, necessary, and really it's good to working people and connects working people all around this country. And anybody going after it should be attacked and fought, because it really is anti-people.
Well, Chuck, that's a great spot to end. We will put those links for people to sign petitions and whatever on Cindy Sheehan's soapbox, and we'll get that sent out as soon as possible. But I'm so glad I invited you. This was a really great discussion and very important in this time.
Okay, well, thank you for having me come on, and stay strong, Cindy.
Okay, you guys too. Thank you. Well, that's it for this edition of the Soapbox. I'll usually say for this week's Soapbox, but I'm going to try to do 2 or 3 or maybe more soapboxes per week during this time of lockdown to keep us connected, to keep the information flowing out there. And I'd like to thank you for listening to the show and for supporting the Public Post Office. It's really, really important to do that. And I'd like to thank Don DeBar for being my engineer. I'd like to thank Chuck for giving his time to be on Cindy Sheehan's Soapbox. And I am Cindy Sheehan. You've been listening to the Soapbox. Peace out for now.